Oh, welcome everybody on this afternoon on Thursday. It's like we still have a few folks hopping online, so we'll wait just a minute. All right, well, welcome everybody to the Thursday webinar, another Critical Canadian Building Science webinar series brought to you by the team at Building Knowledge Canada and our sponsor, Enbridge. So we've got a special guest with us today that's joined us, Trevor Trainor, and we're going to take a little bit of I'm going to call it a deeper dive. There's a lot of building science topics that deserve a little more time, and one of them that seems to create a lot of confusion and probably takes up a lot more time in our discussions as designers and building science and builders and code practitioners and officials is this thing around vapor and poly. So today is WUFI on the side. Trevor and I thought we'd come up with a nifty little name for the day. WUFI on the side, a quick intro to hygrothermal modeling of standard walls that we all see. How do they actually perform? And maybe this thing of just always going to 6 mil poly as a vapor barrier may not be the smartest thing in some settings. Anyways, we're going to let Trevor sort of take us out of that one. So welcome to our series today. We're going to do a little introductions, and then we're going to do some context setting. We're going to do a poll today, a little longer poll than we typically do, because we do want some feedback. We have had some discussions with various building science folks around Canada who are interested in pursuing possibly revising the reference to vapor barriers in the National Building Code. So your responses today are going to be helpful today in this work. And then we'll leave a little time when Trevor's done to do a little Q&A, maybe 15 or so minutes. So again, if you have questions as we move through today, questions that are technical in nature for Trevor, myself, or others, please put them in the Q&A. Do not put them in the chat. In the chat, please keep the chat respectful, thoughtful, like we say, good Canadians. And in the chat, if you have admin issues with your computer, hearing things, seeing the screen, Stacy is in the background there to help you on our building science team. The webinar is recorded today. You will also be getting a survey following up this session today, along with a link to the recording. You're welcome to go on to listen, share with your team. It will reside afterwards somewhere out on the internet where you can watch this. It's also on our website. I'll also bring you just a note on that. We had a previous session that Trevor had done for us on vapor control layers, I think. So I'll have to go back and find out which one that was. Closed captioning is also enabled. I see some of you are using that today. So quickly, as we normally do, give us a sense of where you are calling in today from. I'll give you a minute there to tell us where you're from. Again, looks like we've got just about every province represented, I believe. Look at there, and we've got some folks from the US as well. Good. Number of folks, half or so from Ontario. It's good. All right, let's, and now if you don't mind, let's give us a sense of where you're, what you do on a day-to-day basis. What's your occupation? Yeah. What keeps you busy? Nice to see a lot of reoccurring names out there. Have you back? Oh, very good. Lots of builders, some engineers, architects, energy advisors, consultants, a number of folks, building officials, contractors, sales reps. Good. Excellent. Thank you for that, folks. Always helpful to see who's on. So we'll move ahead. There's your results. We'll move ahead with our presentation today. I'd like to introduce Susan Cudahy. Susan, welcome.
Thanks, Andy. I I'm going to start today's session with a land acknowledgement, and then we'll move into a quick safety moment and a thanks to the industry. So very pleased to be hosting today. We'd like to start today's session by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and historical lands of the original people of Turtle Island, who have been the caretakers of these lands since time immemorial. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and our acknowledgement of this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources of and the relationship to Indigenous people, and we all have a responsibility to honor that. So we'll just move into a really quick safety moment. And I'm sure the majority of you have seen this, but just a quick reminder, what to do if for any reason on any site, there's a damage to a natural gas line. So quick 4 points: stop the work immediately, clear everyone from the area, call 911 if you hear gas escaping, and call Enbridge Gas Emergency Line 1-866-763-5427. And thank you very much for posting that. That's will be in the slides that you get after as well. So just want to move on really quickly to a special thanks. For those of you that were involved with our OEB decision earlier in 2024, I just want to thank everyone for their support through the efforts with Bill 165, the Keeping Energy Costs Down Act. This legislation reinforces all of the critical role of natural gas in keeping energy costs down and the true importance of natural gas in Ontario's measured energy transition. And all of your ongoing partnerships with us here at Enbridge have been so essential and will continue to be, so that all of us can ensure that the new homes have access to choice and reliable, affordable energy. Energy that's going to be available now, but also for years to come. So as we as a province continue to grow, the government's efforts to build more homes faster will make home ownership accessible and affordable. So thanks to all of you on this call who helped to make this happen. And we as Enbridge Gas are really proud to be able to support and partner with all of you and with Building Knowledge on this series. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Andy.
Thanks, Susan, very much. Very much appreciate that. And all the support Enbridge has given to the residential building industry to help building science be a focus to solve a lot of the challenges we have today. So good. We've had a couple nice little notes in the webinar on the content in the chat there. I noticed during the land acknowledgement that we have Jeffrey St. Pierre calling in from the unceded territory. Trevor, I'm going to have you pronounce that.
Oh, I'm probably not the right person to do that. I think
well, it's good to have you here, Jeffrey, and thanks for the acknowledgement to that to the people of the beautiful river. So as we move forward, actually, with that, Trevor, maybe just introduction of yourself, and also I think it's really important too for you to tie in as well your background, your support of your Indigenous community, the Indigenous communities across Canada, and the work you're doing even in the far north, if you could for a minute.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Trevor Trainor. I am a member of the Thessalon First Nation. I'm also the president of Oding Building Science, and I established Oding Building Science about 3 years ago now. For the purpose of focusing on Indigenous housing issues and how building science can contribute to resolving some of those issues. Currently working with multiple First Nations groups in Ontario, Manitoba, but the majority of my work is occurring in the Arctic. I'm doing a lot of work for Nunavut Housing, research and consulting work for them. One of the big projects I'm working on right now is monitoring alternative roof systems throughout different regions of Nunavut for their hygrothermal performance to avoid mold growth, rot, and moisture problems.
Very interesting. Yeah, very extreme conditions inside and outside, but that's pretty neat. Well, Trevor, it's good to have you today. Of course, I'm Andy, Building Knowledge Canada, the Vice President here. We work out of the Guelph, Ontario area. We have clients and builders across Canada and some down in the US. And we're very, very fortunate to work with the builders we do, the renovators we do, and associates like Trevor, who are incredibly smart and keep us on track of what is actually real. So quick, as we get started here, we're going to have you do a little poll for us. So folks, get your fingers ready. We want to understand, number one, do you find the Ontario Building Code or the Part 9 building code helpful in regards to vapor barriers as it's defined in the National Building Code and the Ontario Building Code? So just give us your quick opinion. And I know that we all have an opinion on this one. All right, that's good. So we've got about a 70 to 30%, 70% saying no, 30% saying yes, that it provides helpful guidance. So it does provide some guidance. We're not saying it doesn't provide any. We're looking, I guess, maybe first input, does it provide good clarity, prescriptive clarity? Let's go to the next question, if you don't mind, Stacy. Let's go to the next one here. Does the National Building Code, the Ontario Building Code, clearly address vapor barriers, or does it actually create confusion? So now it's not just, is it helpful or not? Does it actually, in its current wording, create more confusion? Just a simple yes or no. I think we have a poll for that one too. Okay, so there it's even higher on creating confusion. It's interesting. Trevor, is this sounding familiar to you?
Yeah, I get a lot of phone calls to try and help with some clarity for sure.
So the next one is, what is your experience in coordinating the design of vapor barrier, not air, remember, vapor barrier design with designers, code officials, and architects? Interesting. It's all in the way you word a question, I guess. No, thank you for that, folks, very much. So split between straightforward, very confusing, with a high percentage, 62% saying our entire industry needs some help on this. All right, we're going to give you another question. Have you any experience with coming across situations or assemblies where the use of 6 mil poly, so in other words, a specific material as a vapor control layer, has caused concern? And remember, this is something, you know, I think Trevor will probably say on and off today, is that 6 mil poly is what, 30 times more impermeable than it needs to be called a vapor barrier as per the building code. 65%. Interesting. Very good. So the last question for you, again, thanks for bearing with us. Is there a clearly defined process or guidance to use readily available products as opposed to 6 mil poly? In other words, is it easy for designers, builders, constructors to choose something different than 6 mil poly as a vapor control layer? Not an air barrier, not a water resistant barrier, but as a vapor control layer. I don't see the, oh, there we go. So we've got 83% saying no and 17% saying yes. Interesting. And again, that seems to ring true, doesn't it, Trevor? There's going to be some areas, some regions where maybe there are some clear answers. But for the majority, I think what we see across Canada is some nuanced, especially in the Part 9 world. It doesn't seem like there's a clear line of sight as to how to prescribe readily available vapor control layers.
Wow.
All right. Thank you, folks, for that. So I'm going to do some context setting. And again, I'm just going to read some of these slides just so we're on the same page. For today's discussion, the air barrier in assemblies is deemed to be a separate control layer. So we're not going to use the old AB/VB. We're going to assume that for the sake of the study today, air tightness is taken care of, whether it's an inside air barrier, an outside air barrier, one or the two, and that the air tightness is approximately code level. National Building Code of 2.5, Ontario Building Code of 3, and of course, for you energy advisors and geeks out there, all the nuances of 0.26 NLR versus 3.0 for attached on the National Building Code. There you go. The building code reference, just to be clear, for those of you in Ontario, it may be news to you. You folks have adopted a little more of the National Building Code. The National Building Code's actually added some sections that talk to the thermal performance or the vapor performance of thermally insulated foundation wall assembly. So in red, this is something that is fairly new. It was worked on, I think, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, actually. Doug, Terry, myself, there was a number of folks, maybe some of you were on that. John Straub had some input and others, where we started to actually see some willingness at the national level to start to adopt other solutions other than straightforward vapor barriers. And it's the first time that we have reference to variable perm vapor barriers, and it's in regards to using something like that below grade. One point we want to bring to you is in the Canadian context, we don't use terms like perm. We use the basically vapor barrier, and vapor barrier is described as something not greater than 60 nanograms per Pascal per meter squared. Again, just for your reference, it does talk about coatings in the National Building Code and the Ontario Building Code about coatings and what their certifications are needed as. There is reference to foam plastics, if used as a vapor barrier, need to meet certain requirements. Those requirements are actually acknowledged, sorry, getting out of order here, are actually acknowledged in this section. So that's the installation of vapor barriers on the warm side. Different products can be used as the vapor barrier, or what we would challenge today, the vapor control layer to prevent condensation. And then also something that Trevor and I just want to get out there is just an understanding that the Canadian 60 nanogram definition of a vapor barrier is approximately, not exact, but approximately the same as 1 US perm. And we tend to use this language interchangeably. But on the second bullet point, just so you know, the only place that we hear terms around vapor, perms or type 2, type 3 vapor diffusion retarders is from the US code. None of them relates to the Canadian code, and yet a lot of our manufacturers are using this language, and it becomes very difficult in the Canadian context to figure it out and reference it. So here's what we're proposing. We're proposing that the National Building Code references and definition of vapor barriers, number one, need acknowledgement of vapor diffusion retarders as opposed to vapor barriers. Number two, we're also proposing that there needs to be an increased prescriptive clarity on how to provide vapor control options outside of what we currently have. And what we're proposing is that we look south of the border, which, to my understanding, Trevor, actually the work that was done south of the border that we'll look at in a minute was actually done by some of the Canadians, like Joe Steve and some of the others. So, I mean, it's good old Canadian building science anyways, right? But let's just show you what we're proposing. So in the US code, they have created what we would say is a clear line of sight for a residential builder as to what they need for vapor control. So here's the perm, the different types of perm. There's type 1, type 2, type 3, type vapor diffusion retarders. Type 1 is going to be something that is going to be very similar to what we would or much less than what we have here in Canada. Type 2 would be very similar to something that we have here in Canada. Type 3 would be a little bit more, I'm going to say loose, semi-permeable. But here's how they apply it, which we find is interesting. In the US, if you're building in certain climate zones, if you are using any type of insulation on the outside of a certain wall with a certain type of insulation, cavity insulation, it gives you prescriptive definitions of what you can use. So as opposed to using, for instance, in our climate zone, let's say Toronto, or climate zone 6, somewhere up in Sudbury, climate zone 7 and 8, Edmonton or Calgary, if you were using R10 on the outside of a let's say a 2x4 wall, or 2x6 using R15, you would be directed to use no more than a type 3 vapor diffusion retarder, which guides you towards latex paint and a 1/2 inch of gypsum. So without having to do a third-party engineering write-up, this is very, very prescriptive based. The other option too is, this is actually brand new to the 2021, is a type 2 vapor diffusion retarder can be used in these certain climate zones when you have a certain amount of insulation on the outside of certain types of walls. They've also gone another step further, that when you have full rain screens, or more than that, let's say a more prescriptive approach is a full ventilated cladding. When you use that, you can also then be directed to use different types of vapor diffusion retarders in the wall. So again, it's very prescriptive. Again, you can go outside of this and have an engineering report or performance-based report, but it has created a clear line of sight for the builders as to what they can and what they're able to use in these wall assemblies that now mostly include insulated insulation on the outside. So I'm just going to leave it with that. Again, that's what we're proposing. Trevor, I'm going to stop sharing and away you go, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. I'm going to take over the screens here. Let's go with this guy. Okay. Excellent. Yeah, so Andy gave us a great sort of little breakdown of this topic, what's being done.
You have your screen shared yet?
Yeah, can you see my screen?
Nope, not yet.
Not yet? Oh, I have to actually hit the share button too.
There you go.
There we go. Excellent.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, and so one of the things that when we talk about various control layers, and Andy's right, we want to always separate air control from vapor control when we talk about designing walls and evaluating walls. And one of the reasons for that is that vapor control and vapor barriers not only affect how we keep our walls dry, so how we keep moisture from getting into them, but how do we allow them to dry? So it affects both sides of that equation, and that's why we have to be careful. And so when we talk about wetting, there we go. Okay. We talk about ways that walls can get wet. Okay, there's multiple ways. We're going to talk about the big three here right now. First one is obviously rain leakage. That's the one that's, if we talk to insurance companies, that's their biggest claims, right? Rain leakage, usually at windows and other places. So that's one way that walls can get wet, is rain leaking through those layers that are supposed to keep it out. And that usually happens at penetrations and other areas of detail. Another way, and these are sort of in order of importance, is the second way is air leakage condensation. And so if air can leak from inside the building into a wall system and find some cold sheathing in this case, or other surfaces to meet, we will get condensation forming in here. And when we talk about cold climates and very cold climates, especially in the Arctic, air leakage condensation becomes a huge deal. It becomes the big thing we focus on. But for today, we're going to assume that we have perfect air barriers, and we're going to really look at rain leakage, and we're going to look at vapor flow condensation. So what's vapor flow condensation is not the movement of air into a wall to bring moisture with it, but the molecular movement of water vapor molecules through the materials on the outside into our wall system, where then can again find that cold surface to condense on. And so going forward, we're going to talk a lot about rain leakage and vapor flow condensation. And we're going to, for now, ignore air leakage condensation because that's a separate topic all into itself. And then we talk about drying, right? So walls can get wet, walls can dry. We know that. What are some of the mechanisms we can use to dry out walls? Well, we can use drainage and ventilation, but typically with that only helps us in that sort of air gap or that gap between our siding and our house wrap, for example, right? Once water is able to penetrate through and into, the wall cavity, the only real way we have to dry that out is through vapor flow. Unless, of course, we have an extreme event where water's leaking out the bottom of our wall, inward or outward. For the most, in most cases, once water gets into that wall, really the only way it can get out is by vapor flow. And that's why it matters what type of materials we use on the inside and on the outside of that wall system. That's why we have things like Tyvek and other vapor permeable house wraps, and we don't use polyethylene on the outside of our buildings, because that would trap that moisture completely, right?
Yeah.
But in some cases, we do start to put low vapor permeance materials on the outside, and we'll talk a bit about that and how that works.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a oldie but a goodie. This is from John Straub's. I think it's from his original textbook, and you may have seen this many times before. If not, I still like to think about moisture balance in this way. When it comes to wetting and drying a material or a wall system or a roof system, right? Thanks, Andy. This is a great analogy to use, is this moisture balance. So we're putting moisture into a wall, for example. There's different ways we talked about. Rain leakage, for example, condensation due to vapor flow, for example, ways in which moisture is being added to the wall. And then there's ways in which that moisture can dry out or drain out of our wall, in this case, in this analogy. And for the most part, that's vapor flow. And so as long as we can dry out as fast as this wetting is occurring, or we don't get past a tipping point, right? We can keep this level, moisture level at a level that is safe for the materials we're talking about. And that's sort of the other half of this balance, is the safe storage capacity. Depending on what material we use, we could have something that has a large safe storage capacity or something small. In the most part, going forward, we're going to talk about OSB, just because it's the most common sheathing we use, and it's the thing that usually gets wet first in our assemblies. So as we know, there's not a lot of safe storage capacity in OSB. There's some, but not a lot. And so if we're wetting this OSB faster than we can dry it, eventually we're going to tip this over. And that's when we have a real problem. That's when we have mold growth and rot, premature decay of our building enclosure. And that's a problem. So to talk about vapor flow, it's important to realize that there's two things that affect the rate of vapor flow. And that is the vapor pressure difference across an assembly or across a material, and the vapor permeance of that material or of the layers of that assembly. So this is just an example for Toronto. A lot of the examples I use today are Toronto weather. Forgive me if you're from somewhere else.
That's okay. Is that climate zone 5 more or less, Trevor?
It's climate zone 5, exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to use that as a basis, and I will talk about what happens when we go to colder climates for sure. Good. And so if we look at the average conditions, outdoor and indoor in Toronto in July, okay, 25 degrees Celsius outside, 70% relative humidity. That gives us a vapor pressure of just under 2,000 pascals. And indoors, we have, let's say, 22 degrees Celsius, 55% relative humidity, because we have air conditioning, let's say. And that gives us about 1,500 pascals. So what that means is there's a drive in the summer in Toronto from outside to inside, where vapor's trying to flow inward at about 500 pascals of pressure trying to drive that. If we look at the same thing in the winter, right, and let's say average January conditions, let's say it's -8 outside, 80% relative humidity. We have a really low vapor pressure, only 263 pascals, right, because it's so cold out. Inside, we have pretty similar conditions. Maybe we have a lower RH, 20 degrees Celsius, say 35% RH. That's actually, I changed that. That should say 541, I believe, once I do the math on that. So I'll get that corrected. But it's about, the point being, it's about the same amount of vapor drive, but in the opposite direction in the winter.
Okay, okay.
Right? So those are peaks, though. Those are like what we see on the extreme ends of weather.
Okay.
But what's really important is what happens more on an hourly basis throughout the year. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But what we have seen in conditions, and thanks for those who shared some great photos with me here today, is sometimes we can get condensation on the inside, or I guess on the exterior side of our poly, when the summer conditions are right, there's enough moisture driving that vapor inward. What's more common in cold climates is we see condensation and moisture problems on our sheathing. This happens to be a roof, because most of my work in the Arctic has to do with roofs, but you can see similar things happen in walls, and that's from that vapor drive outward and condensation occurring on the sheathing as it's trying to drive outward. So both of those things can happen at different times of year, and so we need to be concerned about both of those. But what's sort of the relative vapor drive that we're talking about here? So what I have plotted here, and I've got a real delay on my my laser pointer, but the red line here is, let's just call this interior vapor pressure. If you have air conditioning in Toronto, the blue line is exterior vapor pressure. And this is an hourly point throughout the year in an average sort of winter in Toronto. And what I'm really trying to point out here is that if we were to, and I kind of made up this metric, which are vapor pressure hours. So vapor pressure times that hour, add them all up over time. And what we can see, even in Toronto, about 86% of the hours, or of the vapor pressure hours, are trying to drive vapor outwards from inside our buildings outward. And only about 14% of our vapor pressure hours are trying to drive moisture from outside in. And that becomes really important when we start to look at drying and where we want drying to occur. Let's look at the same thing real quick in Winnipeg, because as we get colder and colder, this becomes more extreme. So in Winnipeg, 91% of our vapor pressure hours are from indoors, outdoors. So this tells us we have a much more a greater drying capacity to dry outwards than we do to dry inwards. Only 9% of the vapor pressure hours in Winnipeg are inward. And as we get colder and colder, I've done this for Iqaluit, and it's about 95 to 5 or 98 to 2 by the end. And so this really helps us understand not only, how we can dry walls out and which direction is there more power to do that through. Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to go through a bunch of models, and I try and use WUFI in a lot of cases to demonstrate things, not always just to evaluate a specific product or a specific assembly, but to, from an educational side, to show trends and show things that are what's important and what's not, and what orders of magnitude can be affected by different factors. So those of you who don't know, WUFI is a hygrothermal modeling software. It models the movement of heat and moisture within and through various building materials and assemblies. And what it does is it uses the material properties, weather files, and interior conditions, and does this on an hourly basis, and so that we can see the effects of different design approaches in different climates. It can also account for the effects of ventilating airspaces or air leakage, and also water leakage. And so for our cases in this set that we're going to look at, we've ignored the air leakage because we want to separate that out. We want to look at water leaks, and we want to look at vapor flows. And I'll explain a bit more about that as we go. And so the outputs from the model include hourly measurements or predictions of moisture contents, temperatures, and RHs at different layers and different materials in the assembly. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of models and a bunch of results and sort of explain, that help explain some of these phenomena. So just looking at material properties, first of all, one of the really important ones that we need to have in this model is for oriented strand board is its moisture storage function. And so this little chart over here is right from WUFI, and it shows for this version of OSB what the moisture storage function is. And what the moisture storage function is, it's the amount of moisture in the material when it's in a given environment of RH. And so what you can see here is that up to 80, even 90% relative humidity, there's only small changes in the amount of moisture that will be deposited into OSB. But once we get up to about 90 and over 90% relative humidity, there's a huge jump in moisture content. And so it's important to note here that I think about 250 is about 20% moisture content. So we can actually get over 20% moisture content in a material without condensation, just by being in a high humidity environment. And so we also get into liquid transport and other factors that are really important in how this behaves. And these are all built in. They can also be customized within WUFI if you want to, if you have custom materials that you want to place into the program. But for ours, I just used the standard OSB. And another thing, material property that's really important in the models I'm showing is the vapor permeance of a bunch of materials in the models. What I'm showing here is just sort of a quick, and I won't get into all of this, but what we can see is the blue line here is the vapor permeance of 6 mil poly. The gray line is a specific product, Intello Plus, which is a smart vapor retarder. The orange line is another different type of smart vapor retarder. It's a polyamide, similar to membrane. And what we can see with these two is that as the relative humidity gets higher and higher around these materials, they become more and more open to vapor flow. And so this can be helpful in certain circumstances if we get moisture into our wall to help get it out. And we'll talk more about that in our models as we go. And then just for reference, this is our one perm, right? What the NBC says is a vapor barrier. Anything below that would be a vapor barrier. Mm-hmm. And when we start to talk a little bit about vapor barrier paints or vapor barrier primers, they sit right in around this area, whereas latex paint is up in this area. And so this actually goes well with what Andy was showing us before with what the Americans are doing, and saying that anything below 0.1 perm is that type 1 vapor barrier, vapor retarder. Between 1 and 0.1 is that type 2, and between 1 and 10 is that type 3. So you can see how these materials sort of fit into that framework. And I think it is a good framework and something we should be talking more about in Canada. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. The other material property is the vapor permeance of the outer materials that are really important. I find this really interesting because OSB is shown in yellow and plywood in orange, and they actually behave very similarly to those smart vapor retarders we talked about. As they get into higher RH environments, they allow more drying or more vapor flow through them, which allows for more drying. So that's really important to know. 1 inch of XPS, I'm going to use that in a bunch of models. It shows where that sits. Again, somewhere below 1, so that would be considered a vapor barrier in our code. And then other materials that are much more vapor open would be mineral wool and fiberglass, which are these two lines up here. Very vapor permeable, right? And Tyvek, I wanted to show too that it's significantly more vapor open than what it's covering up in this case, which is the plywood or the OSB. So just a real quick overview, just to get an idea of what some of these materials are that we're using in the model, so that it'll help sort of explain some of these results. The other thing that WUFI does is uses very specific weather files. The weather files that are in WUFI today are based on historic data. And if we want to start to think about climate change and the effects of that, especially on rain and driving rain, we might want to start looking at getting some customized weather files. I think they're actually available to purchase, weather files that are based on different models of future climate change.
Yeah, and there is actually a report that's available by the National Research Council that was just done on this. They looked at the predicted weather implications of the 1 to 1.5 temperature rise. And if I remember right, Trevor, things like driving rain, the windrows saw in many areas of Canada almost a 70% increase.
Wow.
Very significant. And the
very
relative humidity, the moisture content of the
Yes.
air elevated to the point where the drying potential disappears as well too.
Really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm using in the models today is what's sort of the existing Toronto weather file, which is based on historic. This, Andy mentioned the driving rain rows. This shows what direction driving rain comes at for in Toronto, the specific weather station that was looked at. When I looked at this, I wanted to do all of my walls facing southeast, so we get the maximum amount of driving rain. If I was to do the exact same analysis for driving rain and put it on a northwest wall, I'd get much different results. But I wanted to kind of look at the most extreme in terms of the current driving rain rows. Although we know in the future, this may become even more and more extreme in terms of how much driving rain hits our walls. And the reason that's important is because we use a certain percentage, usually 1% of driving rain injected into the walls as a stress factor for the walls. And I'll explain a bit more about that. So yeah, all this data is in the model being used for the results we're showing. Now I'm going to show you a lot of graphs coming up. And I want you to understand, first of all, what we're graphing, right? All the graphs I show you are the moisture content in percentage of the sheathing, in this case, the OSB sheathing. And as we go, you'll see that anything below 20% moisture content for OSB, we'd consider that at low risk for mold growth, rot, and decay. Once we get above 20, between 20 and 28%, we can consider that a moderate risk or a medium risk for mold, rot, and decay. Once we get above 28%, we're in the high risk zone. So I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs and we'll see where they land within this zone. I also always show a 3-year period. And sometimes year 2 and year 3 look different than year 1. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through.
It's often good to be reminded too that 28 to 29% moisture content for most of the wood that we build with is considered to be fiber saturation, right? Like we often think of 100% being saturation, but it's actually only 20 to 29. That's the stage at which all the areas outside of the cell are filled with water, but not the cell itself.
Right. Yeah, it's important to note that moisture content is the percentage of the weight of that material that is water, not the percentage of the maximum amount of water it can hold, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's those air gaps. It's filling those air gaps, like you said. And yeah, saturation is in this 30% range, depending on the exact material we're talking about. So when we start to see levels above that in our model, we know that there's liquid water right on the surface. It's not even in the material anymore. It's right on the surface. It's a good point. So yeah, again, important to note when we talk about wetting events in these models, we're talking about vapor flow, condensation, and we're talking about rain leak, and I'll break those out. But we're definitely not talking about air leakage condensation in these models, because we can't model those two things at the same time because they kind of counteract each other. We have to model them separately. So we're not going to talk about air leakage today. That's a separate day. So the first set of graphs I'm going to show you is a standard wall with just house wrap on the outside and a ventilated cladding we talked about. So that's what this represents, right? Drywall. In this case, we have a polyethylene vapor barrier, an insulated 2x6 stud with bad insulation. Doesn't really matter if it's mineral wool or fiberglass. Then we have our sheathing membrane. In this case, we used spun bonded polyolefin, which is basically Tyvek, an air gap, and then our cladding. So all of the models will kind of have a little diagram like this. I just want you to understand what those are. So if I run my model and I have no rain leakage and I have poly on the inside, this is what my moisture content looks like in my sheathing. It just kind of bounces around season to season, very little bit, well inside the low risk zone, right? Obviously, no leakage, no problem, right? So let's start playing with this. What happens if, hey, what if we just take the vapor barrier away? So let's just get rid of it. Now the only thing we have on the outside, on the inside, is our gypsum board and latex paint. What happens to our moisture content? Well, now we're seeing the effects of that vapor flow condensation, and it bumps up into our medium risk zone every winter if we do that. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to just get rid of our vapor control, right? We just want to understand it better. But it's interesting to see when we get into other models, when we start to have rain leakage, how much of it is due to vapor flow, how much of it is due to rain leakage. So now we're going to take that same wall, we're going to put the vapor barrier back in, and we're going to add a 1% rain leak. So of the driving rain that hits that wall, 1% of it gets in to the inner surface of our OSB sheathing. And this isn't just a made up number, it's actually part of ASHRAE 160 standard moisture control design analysis, where they basically recommend and talk about a wall should be able to handle a 1% rain leak and without causing any accumulation of moisture or extreme moisture contents in the wall. And as we can see in blue here, when we add that 1% rain leak in, it did jump up our moisture contents, but it's still well within the safe zone here. So that standard wall, right, with the poly and the Tyvek on the outside can handle that 1% rain leak. And it does that by drying this moisture outward through that Tyvek into this ventilated space and dry it away. So those drying mechanisms we've built in can work for that. What if happens if we take a little more extreme approach? What happens if we just add 4% rain leak? We could go everywhere in between, but I want to jump up a little bit here. So if we have a pretty major leak, you can see what happens. A lot of time spent in this medium risk zone every year, starting to get up into the high risk zone for large chunks of the year. It does still dry down every summer to a certain level, but there are a lot of months in here where it's up in that high risk zone.
Yeah.
So that's really concerning.
Moisture content that's high enough that for that sustained amount of time, you will start to see staining.
Absolutely, yeah. Once we get into that range, yeah. If you were to open this wall up after 3 years, you would see those watermarks. You'd see swelling of the OSB. You will probably start to see mold growth at this point in this type of scenario. In this, maybe not, but definitely how much time is spent in this medium risk zone, we would definitely start to see mold growth in this one. And then I wanted to just try something interesting, right? What if we just say, what if we keep our 4% rain leak, but we add in a smart vapor retarder instead of our poly? What happens? Not much. We actually get a little higher peaks because we're getting a little more vapor flow condensation. We dry down a little bit more in the summer. But I just wanted to say, it's adding a smart vapor retarder isn't a, solution to a bad water leak. Okay?
To a bad water leak, that's right.
Okay.
I love that point, Trevor. This is something Trevor and I have talked about when we were preparing, is just to remind everybody that poor liquid water management, good luck finding a wall that will dry fast enough to take care of poor water management. It doesn't exist.
Yeah. If you think back to that balance, the Straub's moisture balance, if you're dumping water in with a hose, there's no way it can dry fast enough. You're going to be over the tipping point, no matter what moisture storage capacity you have, or no matter what, you just can't dry fast enough.
Yeah.
And so that was just the first set of models I did to try and understand, how does the standard wall work? How can it, can it handle 1% rain load? Yeah, no problem. It can't handle 4%. There's somewhere in between, right? Where you're at a tipping point. 4 is definitely not going to work for you, whether you have poly on the inside or some type of smart vapor retarder. But now let's dig into some different types of wall, because I don't think too many of us are building this way or going to build this way for much longer, according to our energy codes, right?
Agreed.
So what happens if we start adding exterior insulation to our walls, and specifically foam board insulation? The models I run next are actually with XPS. We could do it with different foam boards. You might get slightly different answers, but very similar results for the different foam board installations.
So is this a type 3 foam? Would that be about the rate the permeance of a type 3?
Of a type 3 vapor barrier?
Type 3 foam, sorry, so it'd be an extruded polystyrene.
This is extruded
That's
polystyrene.
extruded, okay.
And the models I run, well, you'll see, but yeah, we start off with 1 inch because that's really common. R5, 1 inch, what happens? So I'm going to leave the red line in here, which is our standard wall, back to the old wall with 1% rain leak, okay?
Mhm.
And then what happens if we take that same wall, we add 1 inch of XPS, everything else remains the same. That's this blue line. And what we see here is that we're seeing much higher moisture contents. And more importantly, we're seeing it rise up every year over these first 3 years. If I were to show this over a 5 or a 10-year period, it would keep going up, maybe not at the same rate. It would start to flatten out, but it would definitely get into this high risk zone. So that same 1% rain leak that was okay in the standard wall when it could dry out through that Tyvek is now a problem because we don't have the same drying capacity anymore. Because we've got poly, we still have poly on the inside, and now we have this other vapor, retarding layer on the outside. And so that's the really scary one. That's the one we need to kind of think about how we're going to avoid this problem.
And that's where in the building code, when it says if this is the case, that the material is a lower perm, you would go to section 925, which would then, encourage you to reduce the condensation potential of the wall. Right?
Yes.
In
Yeah,
more
exactly.
ratios.
And I think though that's more related to air leakage condensation, which we aren't getting into here. So this concerns me, and I think this is what needs to be addressed in the code, along with the effects of exterior insulation on air leakage condensation, because typically it reduces air leakage condensation by adding, but there's other factors that we need to account for. So let's try a few other options here. What happens if we were to take that vapor barrier out, we take our poly out and we put in our smart vapor retarder in this wall system? What does that do? So as you can see, it actually makes the first couple years worse, which is kind of scary. But what it does is now we don't see that climbing moisture content anymore.
Interesting.
This is the way it acts every year. And it does get well into this medium risk zone. However, it's not going to keep climbing up into the high risk zone like our poly wall would. So there's definitely some benefit to doing that. But I think still has some risks for sure. And so what happens if we were to just get rid of our vapor barrier again, like we did in the first one? Let's just go with, in this case, drywall with latex paint. That's the black line. Not good. Not a good idea, right? We're still not there. This is going to keep climbing. This is kind of even worse than, it's going to climb faster than the poly wall. And that's because we're still adding moisture from vapor flow, because the amount of exterior insulation we used isn't enough to drive the temperature of our sheathing above the dew point. So we're still getting quite a bit of vapor flow condensation, and we still have the drying problem to the outside. So definitely we don't want to just drop the vapor barrier. That's not going to help us. So let's talk about some other options. So what happens if instead of R5, now we use R10 exterior insulation? I don't know how many people, obviously when it comes to building net zero, or certainly step codes, higher levels of our step code, when we get to that, we're going to have to start thinking about putting more than just that minimum R5 on the outside, even in Toronto. So what happens if we add R10, just as an example? So again, the red is our baseline. That's our old wall, original wall. We're going to add R10, 1% air leakage actually is even worse, because now it's drying even less to the outside because we've added more vapor resistance to the outside. So this is climbing even faster because we still have our poly layer on the inside. It can't dry in, can't really dry out. So what other options do we have? Now let's add that smart vapor retarder back in. So that's the green line.
Right.
Now we're talking. So because we've added more exterior insulation, we've reduced the risk for vapor flow condensation. And since we've replaced our poly with the smart vapor barrier, we have some drying to the interior. And this is a real tipping point, I think. This can really make a difference once we start to get into these higher performing walls. To replace our poly with a smart vapor barrier can really start to make that big difference.
And that's interesting, Trevor, because if you look at the US IRC vapor diffusion retarder charts for climate zone 5, this is almost exactly I recommend. If the insulation is a lower perm, they would recommend a type, I think it's a type 3 vapor diffusion retarder, which is a coat of latex paint.
Yeah. So in this case, we've got that smart vapor retarder, which does act as a pretty good vapor barrier in the dry conditions, but when things get wet, it can open up and allow some drying. So that's really helpful. When we start to get into these higher performance from a thermal perspective, exterior insulated walls. What else did I add? So what happens if we just take the vapor barrier out? What if we just use no vapor barrier? Again, so this is now just the latex paint. That's the black line here. So it's still way better than the poly, but not as good as that smart vapor retarder.
Interesting.
But it kind of starts to show you the relative effect of stopping vapor flow condensation, but still allowing some drying to the inside.
Right.
So that's, again, that balance. And so in this case, that smart vapor retarder is the nice balance point where we're still allowing some drying to the inside and still preventing the vapor flow condensation. So that's our best approach when it comes to this wall with 2 inches of XPS insulation. So just a real quick look. You've already seen these charts, but this is just the R5 wall data compared to the R10 wall data. And you can really see the big difference here is the effect of the smart vapor retarder, the green line. When we only have R5, it doesn't make much of a difference. It doesn't help us much, but once we get to that R10, it makes a huge difference.
Right.
We can also see in this analysis that if we're still using poly on the inside with our R10, that moisture content is going to grow even faster with that poly still on the inside for an R10 wall versus an R5. Because we still are getting some drying to the outside with 1 inch of XPS.
Right.
And we're getting much less when we double that. So some interesting comparisons and some interesting ways to start thinking about how do we balance these things? How do we balance the vapor permeability inside versus outside and the insulation value outside? All these things interact with each other. And Andy's right, that's the way we need to be able to write that code, like in a very similar way to how they've done it in the US.
Using Canadian building science as a reference.
It's all been, so is theirs. Exactly.
I know a little while ago, you and I had posted some stuff on LinkedIn, and I think both Joe Stebrook, Dr. Stebrook, and Dr. Straw both hopped in and commented that count us in. We know it needs to be changed in Canada. It's just how we go about it, anyways.
Yeah. And how to do it in a way that makes the code not more confusing.
Right.
Get less confusing. It's definitely possible if it wasn't done in a very thoughtful way that it would just get more confusing in the code than it is. So
and I think
that's the challenge.
The timing for this is very important, and I don't think anyone would disagree here. But when we look at the tiered energy code, moving us to tier 4 and 5, where we're talking about exterior continuous insulation levels of a minimum R5, but likely 7.5 to R10 in many climate zones, this becomes very, very important. you know, this is one of those things where we need to address as a nation at a national level as the province and territories in the new Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Code. Because if we don't, as we move up these levels of energy efficiency, we could end up with worse problems if we don't make the link to good building science practice more prescriptive and easy.
Yeah. Unintended consequences are we've been there, and we don't want to go there again for various reasons. So let's look at some other options while we have some time here.
Yeah.
What if we ditch the foam in this case, and we tried using mineral wool exterior insulation? Let's see how that affects these models. So again,
the house looks familiar.
Oh, does it? That I worked on this house is in Stratford. It's not my house.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's 2 blocks over, and good friends and consultant for the builder, for the homeowner. Let's see. So the red again is that standard wall that we talked about right at the start, and we want to compare everything to that. What happens if we take that standard wall and we add R4, so an inch of mineral wool insulation on the outside, like we saw in that picture? Well, that's the blue line. Well, it just got better. We only added R4, so we, but we've still allowed all the drying capacity to the outside. And as we talked about earlier, there's more drying capacity to the outside than there is to the inside in Toronto climate. And certainly as we get colder and colder from that, even more so. And so by making this outer layer vapor permeable, and even adding a small amount of insulation can be done without creating a moisture problem.
Right.
Pretty cool. Now this wall still has poly on it, right? In this case. Let's see what happens if we just take the poly out. Even though this drawing I need to update, shouldn't have poly. So the green line is R4 mineral wool, no vapor barrier, so just the drywall and latex paint, and it still has that 1% rain. So you can see with the R4, we do start to see some vapor flow condensation happening. That's why this green line jumps up higher than the others. However, it's still sort of it's within the low risk zone. Maybe starting to get, maybe if you had a high RH inside your house, higher than 35%, which I use for these models in the winter.
Yeah. And that's the building code reference, right? It assumes 35% at design conditions. Interior.
Yeah, you can put anything you want in. I should have mentioned that for these models, I used a 35% winter.
That's good.
55% summer, just for the purpose of this modeling. Obviously, if you were, you had a grand piano and you're trying to keep it, I don't know what people try and keep it at if they have.
It's at 40. So in our house, we have my wife and 3 of our children do play the piano, and we keep it at 40%, and the piano stays almost perfectly tuned. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah.
So now you could start to peek into this medium risk zone if you did have a high interior climate or high interior RH for some reason, whether it's, in my case, the work I do, overcrowded housing, right? That could be a problem. Or you have other reasons to humidify.
Yes. Yeah.
And then let's look what happens if let's go with an R8 mineral wool, 2 inches of mineral wool on the outside. Still no vapor barrier at all, just the poly. And that's the black line. That's like pretty much the lowest one we've got. It's as low as the R4 with the poly vapor barrier. Right. So at this point, we've put enough exterior insulation to dramatically slow down our vapor flow condensation. And that OSB can dry really quickly to the outside because there's nothing exterior to it to slow it down.
Right. And remind us, Trevor, again, you are using a vented or not a vented assembly?
This is a ventilated cladding.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Now, if you were to take your cladding and put it directly up against the mineral wool, that could really affect that, right? Because now you might get moisture accumulation in your cladding, depending on what kind it was. Right. You don't have that air gap.
And it's always like the conversation around this is good, right? Like if you're building a home in an area of Canada where you do have high rainwater deposition, you would want to build a wall like this because you do have really high wetting potential.
Yes.
I mean, you think of all the fasteners that are going through that second plane of protection, right? And with very limited drying potential to the outside, you definitely want a wall that would have something like this.
Yeah, we often think about that rain screen cladding as being really good for managing driving rain, allowing
Right.
it out, allowing it to dry out. But it also really affects how easily moisture can dry from inside the wall outward,
USB out.
right?
Yeah.
Because we need this vapor needs to pass through all these layers to get outside. In this case, because we have a ventilated cladding, the vapor just needs to pass through the OSB, the Tyvek, and this mineral wool. Then it's essentially outside. But if this cladding was placed tight up against it, if it was metal, for sure, but even if it was solid wood or let's say cement board,
Yes.
and it was placed directly against there, that's our vapor flow is going to really slow down there, and you're going to get moisture accumulation there.
Yeah.
So these are all things we need to think about as think about the pathway that vapor can flow, and if it finds a surface that is lower, or a material that has a low vapor permeability, that's going to slow down there, and that could create a problem.
That's right. That's right.
So this is really important for a couple of reasons, this air gap. And so, yeah, look at the difference between R5 foam board and R4 mineral wool in terms of its ability to handle rain leakage. You can see the really significant difference there. And that's because even if we allow drying to the inside, that's a much less powerful way to dry a wall out. And it's also going to allow a certain amount of wetting in the winter due to the condensation, vapor flow condensation. Whereas when we let it go to the outside, it's really a one-way street. It only dries out in that direction.
I think it's really informative, though, this whole idea that when we start to move past the R5 with low perm insulations, it's almost like a trigger point, right? And of course, we need to remember the air tightness. We can't have really the holistic discussion without the acknowledgement that the air tightness, even in some of those walls at 2.5 and 3, may not be enough. But that's for another session.
That is. But actually, to your point, though, once let's say Toronto, once we get to that R10 on the outside, we've dramatically reduced air leakage condensation also. And that's a bit of a tipping point from that air leakage condensation side of things also.
Very nice.
Things are kind of lining up there for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the perfect wall, right? We're coming back to some of that R10 on the outside. If it's a lower perm, make sure you do more of it. To Straub's point, have enough. But again, rethinking what is happening on the inside now, once we get to those levels of 7.5 to 10.
Yeah. What I tell my clients now, both from an air leakage condensation standpoint and from a water drying standpoint, is that if you're going to use foam board, you have to make sure you use the right amount. You have to make sure you use enough.
Right.
And that depends on climate, and that depends on how much insulation's in the cavity. But if you're going to add mineral wool to the outside of a building, even if you add the smallest amount, you've made it a bit better. You're not going to make it worse.
That's right. Yeah.
Both from an air leakage standpoint and from a drying of rain leakage standpoint.
Right. And Trevor, we did have a question. I don't know if maybe you'll get to it, but just this question on, EPS versus XPS. Again, we could go down the whole rabbit hole on all the different permeances. I mean, we know that expanded polystyrene does have a significant higher perm than does XPS, but then you also get into scenarios where the XPS or the EPS has a, like a coating.
Yep.
What's your experience there?
Yeah, so all of these would change if I was to do it with EPS, but it wouldn't change a lot, especially when we start to get to 2 inches of EPS, right? And so you would see lower peaks but they
Right.
wouldn't be dramatically lower for sure. And that's assuming it's raw EPS. The stuff you buy at Home Depot, you can't really even buy raw EPS anymore. It always has a facer on it. Depending on what that facer is, you may have a higher vapor resistance than EPS with no facer. So
Yeah.
all that sort of plays in to the analysis. But foam board in general is always going to be significantly more vapor tight
Yes.
than that mineral wool.
Yeah.
Which from a vapor flow standpoint, it's like it's not even there. You just
Right.
So yeah, those were all the models I ran, and I kind of was trying to, this isn't the best summary I probably could have come up with, and I'm hoping maybe the discussion will come up with some more, but here's a few points that jumped out at me. And to be fair, to be fair to me, this is the first time I've really sat down and done a series of models with this type of rain leakage.
Right.
Most of my work is related to air leakage condensation. I've done hundreds and hundreds of models to that. And so this was interesting. And I was learning a bit as I went and ran these myself. So what did we learn? In cold climates, drying to the exterior is much more powerful drying mechanism than drying to the interior. And the colder the climate, the greater that difference is. And so if at all possible, we can let something dry to the outside, it's going to dry faster.
The only place where that differs, and just because someone made this comment, I have to make that comment, is we had a session a while ago, years ago, on basements, right? Everything in the cold climate typically, except when it doesn't, dries to the outside.
Yes.
But about 1.5 meters below grade, it is limited to interior drying, and it is a whole different world. Yeah.
Yes, these models are very specifically above grade walls.
Yeah.
And we could do another presentation on below grade walls for sure. But like you said, you don't dry. There's no drying capacity to damp soil. Inward is all we've got when it comes to below grade walls. So that's a great point. Adding foam board to the exterior of the wall sheathing significantly reduces the rate of drying of the wall. Okay, that's a fact, and we can work with that, but that's something we have to realize when we're designing. Replacing 6 mil poly with a lower vapor permeance control layer, or vapor control layer, or a smart vapor control layer allows for some drying to the interior, but it's not enough to take care of a bad water leak, for example, right?
Right.
It's a subtle change that can help us for sure, but it's not going to save us in the event of a major problem.
I will go out on a limb and say it is not enough to save a wall where the windows and doors do not have redundant flashing, sub-sill, and an integrated drain, second plane of protection. It will not save a wall where the windows and doors have not been prepped.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yes. What else do we learn? If we add enough foam board insulation, we can eliminate the vapor control layer on the inside altogether. That gives us a lot more drying capacity for that wall, right? So if we're gonna add foam board, we have to make sure we add enough that we can use a much lower vapor permeance interior vapor control layer.
And again, just to put a pin in that point, for those of you that aren't familiar, the 925 section of the National Building Code, the OBC, called the inboard-outboard ratios, that's where that section sort of leans into that. Now, some would argue that in more extreme situations that there needs to be a little bit more outboard than what's currently represented in those outboard ratios. However, it is a good direction to follow. At least it gives us a decent, conservative, clear, prescriptive route to putting low perm insulations on the outside.
Yes, yes. I dug into that a bit and realized that those ratios are based on not making the wall worse than not having exterior insulation.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so we're not necessarily making them better from a moisture control standpoint. Right. We didn't make them worse.
That's right.
And the other thing that part of the code doesn't address, which would be really useful, is when you start using that vapor closed exterior insulation what that means for your interior vapor control.
Right.
That's
And
sort of
that's
the missing
where,
piece that we can start to
that's,
play with.
and that's, Trevor, that's where the vapor diffusion retarder requirements in the US, that's where they go to the next step.
That's
They say
the
that
step we need to go to next.
that's the step, isn't it? It's where,
Yeah.
okay, here are the outboard ratios, but also here's the inboard layering and control that needs to happen as well. I love that.
Yeah, yeah, they really took the right approach there, I think. I also learned, or we also learned, that if we add vapor permeable insulation to the exterior, we don't reduce the rate of drying at all to the exterior. And so we're always making our wall at least a little bit better, if not a lot better, from a moisture management standpoint by adding vapor permeable insulation to the outside. And this is where I kind of ran out of steam. As we move to higher performance exterior insulated walls, that's where we can start to think about smart vapor retarders, vapor retarding paints, and those less permeable options.
Yeah.
For, I'll update this slide before we send that out. So I finished my thought there.
And one thing just important for everybody to understand, we chose to leave out a critical, very critical conversation so that we could focus in on trying to change the way we talk about vapor control, and that was air leakage.
Yes.
So when you put air leakage into the mix, there are other nuances in here. We have to remember that as many of the good building scientists would say, rainwater control is 1,000 times more important than air leakage control. But air leakage control is 1,000 times more important than condensation and dew point control, which is 1,000 times more important than, let's say, water vapor control. All important. But when we leave out something like air leakage, that's a conversation we'll have to come back to. So, as we build these high performance walls, like Trevor has shown us, as we get into this R7.5, R10, we need to start to think about air leakage control, water control, and different ways of doing not full stop vapor barriers, because the term barrier speaks to full stop. Really what we want is we want vapor control. To at least build walls that are going to last. So,
and someone might be thinking right now, why not model these with rain leakage and air leakage? The reason for that is because the air leakage in the model dries out the rain leakage, and it's a weird. You have to look at them separately because they counteract each other in the model, even though they wouldn't really do that in real life unless you had a rain leak at an exact spot you had an air leak.
So you line up the holes on both sides. It's the perfect wall.
Yeah.
And that's
a really
rain leaks
exactly match your air leaks, you might be okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really, you can't model together with the software that we've got.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning too, many of you would have heard the session. I think Gord Cook did a webinar. We did it, I think about 2 years ago, where how did the 1.5 air change come to be? And when you trace that back in Canadian history, it was Harold Orr, the Saskatchewan home, the researchers at the NRC that identified that why 1.5 was important was because at about 1.5 to 2 air change, they notionally found that large holes with laminar flow had disappeared. So their concern was more about the moisture carrying volume of the air than it was the energy. And that's where the 1.5 came from, right? And we're still at 2.5 and 3 in Ontario and whatever else. But so more insulation on the outside, better air tightness in the future as we move to these walls. Trevor, we do have about 15 minutes and we've got 24 questions.
Oh boy, let's go.
Okay, so I'm going to start to read these off, folks. We'll go through these. I'm going to sort of sort through them as I can. I might answer some of them just so we can sort of move through these. Amelie, good to hear from you, Amelie Caron from Eco Synergy out in Western Canada on the prairies. How can we get training to the WUFI tool? There is training. Trevor, what's the best way for a person to maybe look into some training on how to use WUFI?
Yeah, the company that makes WUFI does do training.
Okay.
I believe there are other third parties that do training, but they're definitely, I would start with talking to the manufacturers. I can't remember the name of it's like a German name.
It is.
the Institute.
Yeah, Fraunhofer Institute.
Fraunhofer Institute.
Yeah,
So
Fraunhofer.
they do offer some training, but so I think there's some third parties that do, maybe RDH.
Yeah.
It used to. Chris Schumacher used to. I'm not sure if he
Yeah.
still does.
That's a good question. We'll just keep moving here. Jeffrey, question, what thickness of OSB and plywood were used? I think you had 5/8, 7/16 somewhere in there.
It was it was the 11/16.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question, William just said, is the poly 100% air sealed to prevent airflow? What if the poly's cutter has gaps? Again, I think we sort of addressed that.
In
It's
the models, it is perfectly yeah.
perfectly sealed. So, and again, we're not talking about volumetric airflow and moisture. Like we said, Jeffrey, we've separated that out. We're dealing only with water vapor diffusion.
That's right.
So that's water molecules actually moving through the material as opposed to air carrying. Jim, this seems to show moisture permeating through the XPS, but really it's moisture from the interior humidity not getting back out. I can't remember what slide that is for.
So vapor can flow through the XPS just slowly, especially the 1 inch. And so we will see some effects of exterior humidity on it in the summer, and we will see some drying through it in the winter, but it's very slow and it makes a big difference. So it's not zero permeability, right? It's
right.
If we look back at that, I think one of those top slides, it's like I think it's a low class 2 vapor barrier.
Okay.
Yeah.
45 nanograms, I think, or something like that seems to ring a bell. Next question, and this is a good one. I tried to find this, was the moisture index, the actual moisture index for Toronto. I know it's going to change for all their weather stations, but do you have it hand?
That I don't know.
Okay, we'll try to find that, Andy. We'll put a
Yeah.
pin in that, see if we find it. I know you could find it if you, obviously it'll be in the ASHRAE handbooks and charts and references, but
yeah.
Japjiv asked, what are the recommended smart vapor retarders? What is the best low carbon, long lasting, non-foam exterior insulation? Sorry,
Yeah.
so that might be going a little bit deeper than what we wanted to, but just real quick, if you want to take the recommended vapor retarders, would you have any sense of like perm levels from a vapor retarder you'd be looking
Yeah,
at?
like we could see, I plotted the 2 most readily available ones for us. Similar, but certainty membrane it's a little more vapor closed.
Yeah.
But yeah, they will both have a very similar result to each other. In terms of insulations, yeah, I mean, carbon's always a big issue. And when we start to get into wood-based low carbon insulations, then we have to really be even more careful about moisture and how they interact. So
yeah. So that's, sorry, the questions are just printing faster than I can actually get to it. Spray foam insulations to the bat, ICF.
Yeah, I mean, ICF is completely different because it's got that monolithic core concrete. What we were really looking at are wood framed walls, so totally different vapor profile. The vapor flow would never be an issue in an ICF wall, but of course, rain leakage at windows and all that stuff still matters. It would be much more difficult to model because I don't know exactly where the water would go if it leaked in at a window. Does it make it to the drywall or does it just kind of soak into the concrete? So from a modeling perspective, it gets really difficult to do those sort of monolithic type wall systems. Yeah.
There's sort of goes into the next question, what are the effects of simulation if we use sprayed urethane on the exterior? I'm going to assume closed cell. We see that a lot on a lot of the large
exterior.
Yeah,
it'd be very similar to what we saw with the XPS. Very similar.
Just as a long one, I don't know if we'll get through it. You mentioned the most of the drive you demonstrated is in to the out, not because it's a cold climate. However, given climate change, major increase in rain and humidity in the summers, how might that impact the WUFI models you showed? In our experience, the terrific rains of 2023, we had mold growth in places that we'd never had in 15 previous years.
Yeah, I'd be
Yeah.
interested to know if that was due to rain
Yeah.
leakage from the exposure of driving rain, or if that's from extended periods of high humidity.
Yeah.
Yeah, though that's a challenge. And I think there will be some shift in that ratio that we looked at. But
Yeah.
in any cold climate, we're still gonna have a much more powerful drying capacity outward over the course of a year, not in the middle of summer, obviously, but over the
Right.
course of a year. Um, Even with
Yeah,
cold.
it'll be interesting. Well, maybe we'll make a point. I'll start to look to see if we can find some of that data and actually see what would happen. That would be
Yeah,
interesting,
yeah,
Trevor, to do a
definitely.
projected.
Mhm.
The next question again is, I think we already sort of answered, well, not this one, polyiso. So polyisocyanurate versus XPS. I don't know if this question has to do with its temperature and R value variability, but
Yeah, I mean, I assume if you're talking about vapor flow through it, if it has a foil facer, obviously it's like that's the almost perfect vapor barrier. That's a problem. There are types that have other types of facers that allow moisture to flow through, but it would still react very similarly to the XPS wall. It wouldn't change much about those models if I were to do that.
okay,
Polyiso.
that's good. Next question is, did you have any experience with the SEGA or the Intello outside of the certainty? Now we've got three good, vapor diffusion retarders or variable perm project or products.
Yeah, Intello, it would act very similarly. I've worked on
Okay.
projects where what I like about Intello is I think it's easier to install. So the buildability of it, I think is better. And the durability of it before it gets covered is really good. And it's going to act very similarly to what I modeled, which was the polyamide
Yeah.
membrane. So I think they're both good products. I think they would act very similarly. There's going to be subtleties in what kind of peaks they meet, but the trends would be the same.
Okay. Because we've got a whole last question. We'll get through some of it.
5 minutes.
So many overlapping items, moisture control, embodied carbon, soon fire resistant ratings for wildfire interface. Is there an app for best solutions? So I'll just real quick, there is what's called a building science advisor. I don't know if it'll go to this depth yet to address things like fire wildlife interface or resiliency, but there is an app that was developed by Building Science Corporation, was launched this last year at summer camp. So you can check that on the BSC website. Also, there is a tool, I believe, and I'm going to get in trouble for putting them on the spot, but I believe that there's a resiliency tool that may be being worked on right now by our friends at LEAP at Intercan. But again, you can contact them and ask them for that. Let me just see here. The thickness was asked again, 5.8/7/16 for plywood and OSB. Let me see here. What about an uninsulated 2x4 assembly with 3 inches of exterior insulation?
So if it's
Our friend Aaron Grin, by the way. Aaron,
oh boy,
thanks for the good question.
just trying to stump me today. Well, if it's an uninsulated wall, then we're not going to have any need for any vapor control on the inside. So it'd be probably better than our R10 with no vapor barrier, which was already good. So it'd be better than that. Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Now we're getting into the perfect wall.
That's right. The perfect wall. So we just want to get into good walls, right? That's
right.
We know we're going to have to build walls with more insulation, which means every wall is going to have less drawing potential no matter what you use. So let's just, what is the better wall? So Gerardo says, what about the R value loss of mineral wool? 20% moisture absorption causes 55% insulation value. How can we assume this change in the results? So would in WUFI, does it look at the absorption? I thought it did look at water absorption.
It can. The moisture I put through was all the way through to the OSB.
Okay.
I could model a leak into the actual mineral wool, but it would be wet for a while, but it would dry very fast. So I think if you were to look at it on an annual energy basis, it would be peanuts.
Okay, thanks for that. Good question. When the removal of 6 mil vapor barrier, what does that do to the mechanical design? Mechanical systems are designed for the air tightness of the home. So just to be clear, this was an anonymous attendee. I don't know the mechanical systems. We're not talking about air tightness here. So we've said that a couple of times. We are assuming air tightness stays exactly as building code 2.5 national, 3 as per Ontario, or somewhere in there, wherever you're at. But we're not looking at air leakage. This is only vapor diffusion. So
yeah, we separate those out both functionally and you can do it physically if you want by using exterior air barrier system and not using your poly as the air barrier. But yeah, you can't just eliminate the poly without thinking about what you're doing for air control.
that's right.
Absolutely.
I'll take the last one real quick, and Trevor, you're welcome to comment. Do HRVs, ERVs address some of these issues? I'm going to say they can. If I would say notionally, yes. HRVs and ERVs are primarily there to create air for breathers. So we have good oxygen and fresh air, indoor air quality. They do, as a byproduct, often help control with moisture levels. You know, in some areas it may be appropriate to use ERVs in so maybe some climate zones like 4 or 5, maybe 6. And some of the colder climates, Trevor, where you might work in climate zones 8, HRVs might be more appropriate. But overall, I would say yes. Trevor, does that sort of?
Yeah, it can affect indoor relative humidity, which can affect the vapor drive and the vapor flow condensation. So yeah, you know, we assumed 35%, which is probably what you would want it to be at, even if you had an HRV, maybe down to 30 in the at the lowest, but below that you start to have other issues.
Good. All right, Trevor, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here, and we are right on time. Folks, thank you for all the questions. That was awesome. That was very, very good. And please share the presentation when it does come out. I'm just going to jump in here and let me see here, get some last slides. We've got some, you can see what I was looking at there. So again, this was sort of our proposition today, was that here in Canada, we do need to start to look at the code level and the standard level of starting to acknowledge vapor diffusion retarders as opposed to full stop vapor barriers. And we need a more precise prescriptive approach for Part 9 residential builders. Something similar to maybe what the US has, which was brought about by good Canadian building science. Just got to add that. We do have a couple more sessions coming up. We've got, there's some changes to the Ontario Building Code as it's harmonized with national around some implications on ventilation and duct sizing. So that's coming December 5th. December 12th, we're actually going to take a run back at the good old drain water heat recovery technology and why all of a sudden that technology seems to be having a rebirth in zero energy ready homes in the US, here in Canada, in tier 4 or 5 homes. Why is all of a sudden this simple Canadian technology starting to see it's actually coming of age? So that'll be sort of neat to see. Make sure you're on our list for our Builder's Digest. We have a brand new one that's coming out here that's got some building science highlights on it. Actually came out today, so sign up for that. And thank you very much. Just again, Enbridge, thank you for your support. But most of all, Trevor, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It was great to have you. And note that Trevor's information will be on the slides. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to him. And we might have to do a part 2 on this one with air leakage and a part 3 for basements, Trevor.
Yeah, there we go. Sounds good to me.
All righty. Well, thank you, folks, and have a very good afternoon.
Take care.